Well, welcome to the Impact of Climate Change video discussion. This is one of several collaborative videos offered during April to discuss current and emerging issues in public safety. I'm Kathy Francis, Executive Director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Emergency Management and Public Safety at Frederick Community College. This series was developed as a result of a shared and valuable experience between Frederick Community College, the University of Maryland Global Campus, and FEMA Higher Education. So there's no doubt that we are living, leading, and learning during a time of great change. Climate change will impact how we live, how we plan, and how we work. Today, we're going to look at technology and how we can use that to understand and mitigate climate change impacts. The panel today includes representatives from the public and the private sectors, including fields of geographic information, local government, and public education. So join me as we meet the panel. First, we'll begin with Mr. Anthony Dowell. Mr. Dowell serves as an adjunct faculty member, Geographic Information Systems, Curriculum Development, and subject matter expert for the Mid-Atlantic Center for Emergency Management and Public Safety at Frederick Community College. Welcome, Anthony. So if you'll please describe how geographic information systems professionals are curating data from varied sectors and providing tools used to develop a common understanding of the impact of climate change.
Sure, Kathy, and thanks for having me today. Being able to accurately understand, predict, and mitigate the impacts of climate change is very reliant on vast amounts of data. And that data covers a wide range of sectors and disciplines. Some of those disciplines are probably a little more obvious, such as meteorological data, geological, environmental, ecological. Some probably are a little less obvious, but they're still crucial in helping us to understand climate change vulnerability and the potential impacts of climate change. And that can include things like demographics, critical infrastructure, economics, and more. That data all comes from different places. It's collected in many different fashions, whether it's through remote sensing techniques, via satellite, aerial data collection, drones, and so on, through field surveys and data collection, or even through connected devices and various networks of sensors that are really spread across the globe. And so GIS professionals, whether those are GIS specialists, data technicians, programmers, developers, they play a really key role in doing everything from processing that data, verifying and validating it, converting it into different formats, as well as maintaining it to ensure that that data is up to date and that data is accurate. And so kind of drilling into that just a bit, in terms of processing and data conversion, GIS professionals are involved with the migration of raw data collected from those various techniques that I mentioned earlier, and putting that raw data into structured and standardized data formats and services that adhere to various industry standards and specifications. They help to document that information with detailed metadata. Metadata is really just information used to describe data, which sounds really boring, but it's really key in helping us to understand things like how data was gathered, when it was collected, limitations that are present within that data, and whether or not it's authoritative. And then ultimately, GIS professionals help to ensure that data and also the technology, it's easily accessible to a very diverse group of end users that are present within the climate change community. They support that through the various data portals and open data hubs that are present through various organizations, but also they help to make data accessible and technology accessible to a wide group of users that might not have previously had access to that. In historic instances, you might have only had a very small group of GIS users within an organization. As that barrier to entry for GIS technologies has started to lower, GIS professionals have kind of shifted, and now they're more responsible for being facilitators, developing easy to use tools and applications that are accessible by a wider audience without the need for specialized technical GIS experience or GIS software.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for helping us understand how you curate a lot of information, and then we'll go a little deeper in just a few minutes. But for now, we understand from our professionals how it's curated, and now we'll go to Tina to understand how it's really used in the field. So I'd like to introduce Tina Laboy to you. Tina is a part-time adjunct professor of emergency management at Frederick Community College. In her full-time role, she currently serves as an emergency management specialist at the Montgomery County Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security in Gaithersburg, Maryland. Welcome, Tina. We're glad you can join us. So Tina,
Thank you for having me.
you are welcome. From the local perspective, the boots on the ground, would you talk a little bit more about how local government emergency managers are the boots on the ground individuals mitigating the impact of climate change? And then talk a little bit about the challenges that you face at the local level.
Thanks, Kathy. I can actually think of a few challenges. I think when we're looking in terms of climate change, I think one of the overlooked challenges is that sometimes our partners on the local level don't always understand that the role that emergency management can play when it comes to climate change and climate resiliency work. So emergency managers, we're the coordinators. Like we are skilled at bringing people to the table. And so not only that, but we're typically the leaders in our jurisdiction for hazard mitigation planning, emergency preparedness outreach, and community resiliency. And so emergency managers really need to advocate for a seat at the table when it comes to these climate change discussions, so that we're not just talking about mitigating the impacts of climate change on the environment, but that we're also looking at resiliency for our community members and our critical infrastructure. And I think another challenge that emergency managers face as the boots on the ground is getting buy-in from jurisdictional leadership, partner agencies, and the communities wherever you are, to be able to better prioritize mitigation and resiliency efforts that are focused on climate change. It's critical to have that community support and buy-in from your leadership so that these initiatives can get funded. There are many grant opportunities available for hazard mitigation, such as the BRIC grants and the FMA grants, but typically they require some sort of cost sharing involved, and whether that's dollars from your local budget or whether that's staff time in putting these projects together. And so while grants are an excellent way at tackling these challenges, jurisdictions have to be willing to provide the support for that important work. And as an emergency manager, it's my job to lay the cards on the table to really bring to light the efforts that need to be undertaken and get buy-in for that support. And another really critical challenge that I think emergency managers face across the country is staffing on local levels for emergency management. And I think it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of emergency management agencies across the country that may only have one person in their county that focuses on emergency management. And there are other jurisdictions that are very heavily grant supported, and some of those grant funds are very subject specific. And so it might not allow them to be able to undertake this climate adaptation and resiliency work. And so often emergency management is underfunded, and we really need to make sure that emergency management at a local level is better funded to not only tackle the traditional work of emergency management that includes hazard mitigation planning, but that we can also have the bandwidth to not only support those mitigation projects, but to be able to proactively look forward and think about hazard mitigation in terms of climate change, adaptation, and resiliency.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for helping us understand the realities emergency managers face, the realities of the environment as it changes, and where we do find gaps in staffing and resources. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we close some of those gaps as we move forward. And now I'd like to introduce you to Lauren Dods, an office manager for the Mid-Atlantic Center for Emergency Management and Public Safety at Frederick Community College. She earned a master's degree in management with an emergency management specialization at the University of Maryland Global Campus. This sparked her passion in climate change studies. Lauren, we're glad you're joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we've heard a lot about the resources that are available, the vast amount of resources that are available from our private sector. We've heard more about the needs at the local level. And now we want you to talk to us a little bit more about how the academic community can inspire students to develop geospatial talent so that we can continue to advance our work in this important area.
That's a great question. So for starters, it's essential that teachers see the importance of GIS and the relevance in their subject areas. A lot of times I hear teachers say, GIS doesn't apply to my subject, or I don't know how to incorporate GIS into my lesson plan. If they don't know where to start, there's lots of programs like the Geo Mentors program, where volunteers connect with K-12 teachers to assist with geospatial technology. Incorporating GIS in education is linked to improved academic performance, spatial and critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, and increased engagement with learning activities. So GIS, the bottom line, I guess, is GIS is fun. It enables students to use data to visualize spatial patterns, linkages and relationships, and supports informed decision-making. GIS equips students with tools and skills that they can use in whatever career paths they choose. So this kind of generation of students, they're incredibly tech savvy. They're growing up in a fast-paced, data visually forward environment, and they pick up concepts really quickly, which makes them the perfect sponges for GIS. I think project-based learning is a great way for them to harness and develop geospatial interest and talent. Students could pick a project based on their interests. They could have students create a question, collect and analyze data, and present the results. Teachers could also incorporate cross-disciplinary studies like math, science, writing. Bringing those elements into the project helps students retain even more information about subject matters and develop greater interest in what they're working on. So for instance, a student interested in history could map out locations of military battles. Nature lovers could map out their favorite hiking trails and state parks. Sports fanatics could map out a football game, or even students that are little social butterflies, they could map out their perfect date. Basically, the sky's the limit with topics that can really be researched, and having students select the topic that they're interested in makes it even more engaging.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate your energy. I appreciate your comments about our students, their willingness to learn, their ability to navigate the tech world. And we really need to tap into that as educators. So thank you so much for that. So we're going to circle back to Anthony. Anthony, would you talk to us a little bit more about the ability of GIS technology to support better understanding and decision-making as related to climate change?
Sure. So the G in GIS stands for geographic, and climate change is obviously an issue that's really tied to geography. It's tied to place. And GIS and location technologies, they're specifically designed to help us understand the where component. But they're also really good at helping us understand the when, and that temporal component in data. It's really important given that climate change is evaluated over such long periods of time, and that we're looking to predict change over such long periods of time. When we really start to think about it, pretty much every element or every phase of climate change study, it requires some level of geographic understanding again, and those are the questions that GIS is really good at helping to solve. Starting looking at how climate change has occurred to date in terms of changes in temperatures, extreme weather events, changes in sea level rise, understanding exactly where these changes have taken place or where they're more severe and pronounced. And GIS is a platform that's very well suited to answer those types of questions. And then building on that, using all that historical information, GIS is a great platform to help us inform and develop very complex models that help to predict not only how those changes are going to continue, but also, again, the where they're going to be most significant. And with that information, that understanding, we can then take that information and we can start to look at the vulnerability and the potential impacts of these changes, based on different criteria, such as where people live, where critical infrastructure is located, and so on. So we can use those tools to identify ways that we can then combat and mitigate these impacts. So again, location and place are really crucial elements to these studies, which makes GIS the perfect lens to be able to evaluate them through.
Would you talk to us a little bit about the value of diversity of thought and collaboration among the GIS community? I know you're a member of multiple groups within the GIS community, and especially help us understand the expansive partnership network, talking about climate change and how you're involved in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of the things I alluded to earlier was, accessibility to wide ranges of data sets. Climate change research, managing climate change, it really requires a multidisciplinary approach. I talked a bit about open data and open data hubs and portals and having well-designed data standards. All of those are incredibly important pieces in making sure that data is widely accessible to large groups of stakeholders. And that accessibility has been driven really, I think, by that open data push that we've seen over the last several years. So we're seeing that many agencies and organizations, they have their own open data hubs or portals. Whether you go to look at FEMA or NOAA or USGS, countless other organizations, they all have their own open data hubs, and GIS is a significant component of those. So you can go and you can search for different GIS data sets. You're able to download that data directly for your own use. You can manipulate it. You can use it for your own studies, for your own projects. And that they also push out live data services that you can then consume. So if you're developing web applications or dashboards, you're able to just take those data sources that are maintained and curated by others, and you can plug them directly into your applications. And those tools that I mentioned, web mapping applications, dashboards, those are amazing tools for being able to share information with a wider audience and making that information a lot easier to digest. So I think in the past, you've seen that a lot of that data, that a lot of that information may have been locked up in different data silos. It might have been difficult for people to access that information. Now we're seeing that those are all very easily accessible. And so that's fostering a lot of collaboration in the industry. And you're seeing a lot of other consortiums and collaborations, an example of which is PREP, that's the Partnership for Resilience and Preparedness, which is a global private-public consortium that's focused almost entirely on improving access to data. So they've got their own hub where they get information from organizations across the globe. So that's just one example, but generally speaking, just that ease of access to data, the increase in more user-friendly and more accessible GIS tools and applications. We're putting a lot of data and a lot of power in the hands of specialists in all different types of fields so that they can look at and evaluate that data through their respective lenses.
Thank you for sharing that, and the open sources and how decision-making has changed and how leaders are using this information to make solid decisions as we move forward. So will you talk a little bit more from the industry perspective, those specialists in the field, those such as yourself and those at your company, about those advanced and emerging technologies that do exist, that are not on the public side just yet, but those technologies that you are using to better serve your clients?
Sure. So, I think big data is one, and big data is definitely not a new concept. That term's been around for probably 10 years or so. But the big in big data, it's just getting bigger and bigger because of the volume of data that we're creating. As we're accumulating and developing more data, our computing capacities are continuing. We have cloud-based solutions to help us crunch all that information. So I think big data and being able to harness all that information and being able to use it to support better decision making and developing actionable recommendations for how we can mitigate climate change. That's one thing that we're going to see more and more of. And then to support those types of analyses, we're also seeing an increase in the use of things like AI and ML, which artificial intelligence and machine learning, to help us improve the accuracy and the efficiency with which we can process, analyze, and make decisions with all that information. So, those are very useful for supporting things like climate change modeling, where we're looking at various different types of scenarios. You've got countless variables that are in play. And so those are tools that we can use to help process all that information a little more efficiently than we would be able to otherwise. But it's also helpful for other activities where we're looking to do things like optimize networks. We're looking at freight networks and supply chains and trying to improve precision agriculture. AI and machine learning, those are tools that can really help us to optimize those types of processes that are really key in helping to fight climate change. And then I think the last thing I'll note is just smart sensors and the Internet of Things, which are really just networks of objects that have embedded sensor technologies. They can talk to one another, and they collect tremendous amounts of data in real time. I think these are going to play a role moving forward in terms of helping us to monitor environments, helping us to assess resiliency, and again, optimization of sustainable practices, things like smart energy grids, precision agriculture. Having those sensors help us to really optimize how we manage those and to do so more sustainably.
Well, thank you. Thank you for helping us understand where the GIS community is today, and then helping us understand where you're going, the value of artificial intelligence, how that's coming into play. We greatly appreciate your expertise. So Tina, would you talk to us a little bit more? We've now heard about this vast amount of technology and talent that is available, but you still have a full-time job to do, and it's still tough at the local level. So how could the GIS community of experts provide greater support to you, to those who are at the local level really making things happen?
I actually think that there are a wide variety of ways in which GIS experts could provide support to the emergency management community. I think one of the things that's great about living in the time that we live in is that we are such a data-driven society. But I think there's still some room to grow in that. And I think, learning more about GIS as an emergency manager, I think a GIS specialist could help us determine what type of data sets as an emergency manager are valuable to my community, and what what data sets would make the GIS experts' job more easier to get the data that they need to ensure that I can have the visualizations that I need. As an emergency manager, I use GIS visualizations for a wide variety of things. And one of the things Anthony actually touched on in his response was critical infrastructure and key resources. When we're looking at hazard mitigation planning and especially climate resiliency planning, understanding where in my community those critical infrastructure assets are is big. By having that visualization, I can better understand not only if there are hazards that are impacting that critical infrastructure piece because they're nearby, it might also have me have a better understanding of what the cascading impacts are, not just to that critical infrastructure assets, but maybe other critical infrastructure assets that are surrounding or maybe that lead to other assets. So that visualization piece is really important, and it informs the mitigation actions that we actually put into our mitigation plans and seek funding for. Another critical way that emergency managers use GIS is we look at data from the US Census and the CDC Vulnerability Index to gauge where there are in a local jurisdiction, where there are overlapping areas of vulnerabilities. And that helps us not only target our outreach programs to ensure that we are being equitable in the way we reach out to our residents, but it also ensures that when there is an emergency, that we are more equitably distributing the resources that we have to be able to help residents in their time of need. And so understanding what kind of data is out there, what kind of data is available to us, and what kind of data will really help us visualize and understand ways that we can better serve our residents, I think would be a great way that GIS experts could help emergency managers at the local level.
Well, thank you, Tina. And from the perspective of the local level, we'll ask you to think big, not necessarily GIS, but really big. What needs to be researched to help you at the local level to understand the impact of climate change?
That is a really, really good question. So on the local level, I think jurisdictions need to be doing a greater look at how climate change compounded with the changes in the built environment are impacting not just our residents, but our critical infrastructure, which is another way GIS experts can help us to visualize and understand those things. But as a community, we need to look at, when we're building up these urban areas, there's both an increase in not just impervious surface, but also surfaces that absorb heat. And those impervious surfaces don't absorb rainfall, and so it's kind of like a double-edged sword in some way, because we're looking at these impervious surfaces increasing, and because of climate change, we have an increase in frequency and intensity of rainstorms that we're seeing nationwide, and actually worldwide. And so when you're looking from a jurisdiction perspective, how are your storm drains handling that increased flow? Are you seeing an increase from your residents in complaints about nuisance flooding from one neighbor's lot to another neighbor's lot that you maybe weren't seeing before? And have you taken it a step further to model how an high intensity rainstorm would impact new construction, would impact an area, and then research measures on how to mitigate that new source of flooding that you might not have anticipated? And then also considering that those same surfaces also absorb heat and contribute to urban heat island effect in these areas. I would also want to look at how, as a jurisdiction, I can mitigate the impacts, not just to residents, but also to our emergency preparedness programs and emergency response programs. And so mitigating the effects of heat on residents, such as providing green spaces to allow some of that heat to dissipate, but also thinking about green spaces as a source of respite. So is the public transportation in my community not there, and folks are walking from point A to point B and they're constantly exposed to that heat? Providing for more green spaces would provide a respite. but also looking at cooling centers, resiliency hubs. Does my community have that? How could I get that in my community? What grants exist to get those options in my community? So there's a lot of things from a local perspective that we could be researching to make sure that we're mitigating the impacts of climate change in our communities.
Well, thank you very much for your insight. We appreciate it. So
Thank
Lauren, we're going to circle back to you. We asked you to generate a little energy and ideas with students about geospatial talent. Now we're going to shift you to climate change. You heard from our industry professionals from both the private and the public sector, all the energy, talent, and skill that's going into that topic. So tell me a little bit about what do students think about climate change? And what can our instructors do to spark student interest in learning more about climate change? As you heard, our industry and private sector, public and private sector professionals are very connected.
So a 2022 EdWeek study on students and climate change found that 91% of students believe that it's real, 6% of students aren't sure if it's real, and 3% don't even believe in it at all. That same survey found that 90% of students wanted to learn more about climate change topics and issues in school. So most students already agree and understand that climate change is real, and there is an overwhelming curiosity about the subject. But there is that small percentage who don't know what they think about climate change or don't think it's real. At the same time, there's also a growing sense of anxiety and uncertainty in students surrounding climate change. A 2021 survey of 10,000 individuals ages 16 through 25 in 25 countries found that 84% were at least moderately worried about climate change, and 68% reported feeling sad and anxious. Climate anxiety has been found in K through 12 students as young as 8 years old. This is a growing problem among the younger generations, and the fact that most states haven't adopted standards in talking about climate change is part of the problem. Studies show that when it comes to climate change, teachers are the top source of information. But when those discussions aren't happening, climate anxiety isn't going to get any better. So how could they incorporate climate change into lessons and conversations that they already have so they don't have to spend hours reworking their lesson plans? It's actually not as hard as it sounds, and there are so many resources out there that could spark ideas. For instance, English teachers could have students read and discuss the climate change focus book, also known as CLI-FI. Students could write a speech, have a debate about climate change, or even work with UNICEF to become pen pals with individuals who have had to migrate because of natural forces due to climate change. A math class could evaluate data on carbon dioxide levels from the Arctic and forecast future trends. Leadership classes could start a recycling program, or school garden, or compost area. A social studies class can talk about weather patterns during a specific event, like the Revolutionary War. George Washington crossed the Delaware River on December 25th, and it was so cold there was ice in the river. Now, fast forward many years later, what do winter temperatures on that day look like now? I can tell you a couple of years ago, my family grilled out on Christmas, and there was no ice in the river that day. There are so many resources, and Google is your best friend in getting ideas. NASA, PBS, NOAA, U.S. Forest Service, and the EPA are just some of the organizations that offer lesson plans, videos, and activities for K through 12 students. The statistics show that if only 16% of high school students in high and middle income countries were to receive climate education, we could see nearly a gigaton reduction of carbon dioxide by 2050. With estimates like that, leveraging the power of education is potentially more powerful than solely increasing investments in onshore wind turbines or concentrated solar power alone. Education is such an important piece of the puzzle.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for first helping us understand that students are aware, a high number of students are aware of climate change. It is producing some level of anxiety as well, and that our teachers, broad-based across the college, across the K-12 environment, could be using it in their classrooms and giving us a few pointers. So would you talk a little bit more about some of the key topics that you think our students really need to know about climate change?
Sure. So when I think of climate education, I think of encompassing 3 focus areas, and I kind of distill it down to the facts, the doom, and the hope. So in general, the facts that students should know would be things like, what climate change is and the difference between weather and climate, what is responsible for climate change, and how do we know exactly? Why does climate change matter? And strategies that we can do at a micro and macro level to adapt and to combat climate change. The doom is probably mostly what a lot of people hear or think about when they talk about climate change, which are important, but those are things like climate change acts as a threat multiplier with implications on social, economic, and political stability. And not everyone in every area will be affected the same. Vulnerable populations are at greater risk of the negative effects of climate change. But we also need to focus on the hope that climate change is a worldwide issue that presents unprecedented challenges, but also brings opportunities to explore new and better paths forward. Diversity, we talked about it earlier with Anthony. It's crucial for innovation, problem solving, and identifying ways to adapt to climate change. Only by putting different perspectives together can we really see the bigger picture and recognize what we're really facing. Jobs that K-12 students will have involving climate change probably don't even exist right now. When people talk about climate change, they tend to focus on the facts, and we hear a lot of doom and gloom. But the problem-focused, panic-inducing conversations are just counterproductive at this point. They instill fear instead of moving the conversation forward. What we need is solutions-oriented education that's accessible to all and geared towards all ages. That could be hands-on projects, biodiversity projects, community service projects to better understand Earth's limited resources and inspire students to be active participants in their own ecosystems and communities. We just have to adjust the narrative to inspire students to think about feasible solutions rather than to simply dwell on the problem.
Well done, Lauren. We really appreciate your perspective. Well, I hope just among our panel that you have a few new tools that you can take back into your day-to-day jobs and that you can talk more about climate change now that you know just a little bit more. So thank you so much for serving as our subject matter experts and bringing new insight into this very important and emerging topic. We appreciate your time, and this video will be showcased to our students. Thank you for sharing your talents.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Nothing, I just fangirl over both of them.